And a good Tuesday morning to you. Welcome into the Nick Craig Show, streaming live this morning on YouTube, Rumble, X, and Facebook. Don't forget that you can take the show with you 24/7 on demand by checking out the Nick Craig Show in your favorite podcast app. You can also listen online by visiting the website nickcraig.com. Our show this morning, as always, is brought to you in part by Melissa Gott and the amazing team over at the Law Group in Wilmington. Visit them online, lawgroupnc.com, or give them a call, 910-251-6088. Appreciate their continued support. We'll hear more from them coming up a little bit later on in the program this morning. Tim Walz is a fraudster. Tim Walz, who back just about a year ago was the set to be the number two man in the United States of America. You'll remember he was the running mate for Harris as the vice president. The governor of Minnesota is a complete and total fraudster. Over the last couple of months, there have been a plethora of stories, a plethora of investigative pieces and information showing that Walz and his administration oversaw what could potentially become, and I say potentially because there's still a lot of questions out there. There's still a lot of time for information to change, for the problem to get maybe way worse than it is thought to be right now. But there is a possibility, when this is all said and done, that what has gone on in Minnesota since around 2020, maybe a little bit before that, could very well be the largest fraud scandal ever in U.S. history. I mean, that's what we're talking about in terms of government fraud. Now, there's been plenty of private entities and businesses. You look at, Enron and things like that were multi-billion-dollar fraud cases. But what we're talking about, government fraud here on the show. There's a possibility that this situation, this story out of Minnesota becomes the largest in U.S. history. And in my estimation, in my opinion, it was completely preventable and avoidable. And individuals had been and were trying to blow the whistle on said issue for a long time, going all the way back to the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic. And those individuals that were, again, trying to blow the whistle on this, trying to get this fraud under control, were told to stop. They were told, you're getting a little too close to the fire on this. They were told that there could be retaliation. There could be consequences if you continue down this path, AKA your job, your livelihood is at risk if you continue to try and expose a massive fraud ring that is running in the state of Minnesota. All of this really culminated the week of Christmas with an individual by the name of Nick Shirley, who is an online independent journalist, reporter, YouTuber, content creator, who teamed up with an individual by the name of David and went through the portions of Minnesota, St. Paul, most prominently the St. Paul area of the state, and dove into they were looking into rampant child care fraud happening in the state of Minnesota. In this video, which has now received hundreds of millions of views across all of the various online media platforms, YouTube, X, Instagram, Rumble, all of the places that you would expect content to be in the modern era, hundreds of millions of views showed very clearly and very obviously that individuals in the state of Minnesota, a lot of them from immigrants from Somalia or part of the Somalian community, were operating illegitimate, not real daycare centers throughout the state of Minnesota. Those daycare centers were billing the state in the tune of sometimes millions of dollars a year, providing alleged child care services and daycare services. Meanwhile, there's nobody there. The facilities are locked. They are not open. There are misspellings on the signs. My favorite, the Quality Learning Center. Was supposed to say learning, but they forgot the N in the sign. So you had the Quality Learning Center. You had another facility of which the phone number went to the switchboard operator at Minnesota Governor Tim Walz's office. The whole situation was out in the public. And it didn't start with Nick Shirley. We talked about this in early December here on the Nick Craig Show, the Nick Craig Show podcast. Check that out in your favorite podcast. So we talked about this in early December when it started once again bubbling to the surface. And this has been something that local news in some portions of Minnesota, to their credit, have been covering for quite some time, but it hasn't received the grandiose, the national scale that things really have picked up, I'd say, over the last month or so, early parts of December till right around the new year. That's when things really started moving. That's when the wheels really got going on this thing, and it started turning into a national story. It started turning into a national controversy, all at the direction of the Minnesota governor, who, as I just mentioned at the open, was trying to become the number 2 man in the United States of America. This is, let this sink in for a second. Had the 2024 election gone differently, the issues and the way in which Tim Walz is handling this situation right now, of which we'll hear from him. He has announced he is not running as the Minnesota governor. He was supposed to be running for a 3rd term. He announced that back in middle parts of 2025 that he was seeking a 3rd term in office. Those plans are out the window, and it's because of the fraud in which he oversaw as the governor. But think about a November night in 2024 going differently, and Tim Walz would now be the number 2 guy in the United States of America. We know the track record of his running mate. We know the inaction and the incompetence of Kamala Harris. That's been well played out for everybody to see. The American people overwhelmingly rejected her because she didn't have any real ideas, put herself in a really rough situation. A lot of it, as always, with the political left, self-inflicted. But he was slated to be number 2. Had the American people voted differently, had the American people not seen the light, the compare and contrast between the Trump and what would be Harris administration, Tim Walz would be the number 2 guy. And having watched this saga unfold over the last month and a half or so in Minnesota, that is a terrifying proposition. Having watched everything that I have over the last 6 weeks or so, the idea that somebody like Tim Walz, who seemingly is incapable of accepting any responsibility for his actions, an individual who is the quintessential definition of an incompetent leader, set to be second in charge, second in command, and having, as you would expect and presume, having the ear of the most powerful person in the United States of America, his running mate, Kamala Harris. Everything that I've seen now, that is an unbelievably terrifying proposition. But that's what we were almost faced with. That's what we almost saw had 2024 not rolled out differently. Now, fortunately, the election, in the grand scheme of things, wasn't really close. When you look at the final results, when you tally all the final numbers up, it was a pretty significant landslide victory for the Trump administration, or for Trump himself, Trump and Vance. 7 of 7 swing states, winning the popular vote for the first time as a Republican in nearly 20 years. A very good night. It wasn't, let's not pretend that this was some razor-thin election. It was not. But there were essentially 2 choices on the ballot. Trump Vance, Harris Walz. And everything that I've seen makes that a terrifying scenario that could have unfolded here in the United States of America. So the controversy has been building. The questions are growing, as you would expect, rightfully so, after folks are scratching their head and wondering how a situation like this unfolded in the state of Minnesota. How rampant fraud at the tune of, at this point, close to $20 billion took place. All eyes, all fingers point to the man in charge, the man at the top, the top dog in the governor. And his responses, his answers to these questions have been completely insufficient. And I think that's part of the reason why he has decided to call it quits and announce that he is not running for re-election. This controversy, this scandal in which he oversaw, which he allowed on his watch, is just too severe. It's too big of a story It's too dramatic. The response has been so abysmal that even I think he knows, or his team knows, whatever consultants or political group he's working with knows that this is completely not possible moving forward. That the only solution for him running again would be abject failure, getting blown out in a gubernatorial election in 2026. So Tim Walz has decided that he is hanging up his hat, that he's calling it quits. Which I think is great. I think is good. I think is what should happen when somebody with as high profile of a political career as he has, the governor of a state, just ran as vice president in 2024, when there's a controversy, a scandal of this size under their direction, under their watch. They should drop out. They should not continue to beg for the trust of the people, in this case, in the state of Minnesota. It would be, in my estimation, completely inappropriate for that to take place. So on Monday afternoon, this was rumored over the weekend that Walz was set to make a big announcement on Monday. It was leaked well before the actual event took place, but it was blatantly obvious that he was announcing he was stepping aside. Everybody was reporting at the Associated Press, Reuters. It was well known by everybody. It was just kind of waiting for the clock to tick to noon on Monday for him to actually make said announcement. And that is exactly what he did. However, the way in which he made this announcement, unfortunately, is exactly what you would expect from the political left. And I'm not going to lay it out for you yet. I'll let you hear it directly from the Minnesota governor himself. But it is exactly the situation that you would expect from those on the political left. And honestly, I think it's a situation that is continuing to put the Democrats in a position where they are going to struggle mightily as we get closer to the general election, or the midterm election, I should say, taking place later this year. Here is the Minnesota governor Monday afternoon.
Well, good morning, everyone, and Happy New Year. Like many Minnesotans, I have to tell you, I was glad to turn the page on 2025. It was an extraordinarily difficult year for our state, and it ended on a particularly sour note. For the last several years, an organized group of criminals have sought to take advantage of this state's generosity. And even as we make progress in the fight against the fraudsters, we now see an organized group of political actors seeking to take advantage of a crisis.
Hold on a second here. So this is somebody else's fault now? An organized group of political operatives trying to take advantage of the situation. That's how he describes people calling out fraud, rampant fraud, tens of billions of dollars worth of fraud in his state. They're taking advantage of the situation. I guess we should have just kept our mouths shut about it. I guess nobody in the media should have talked about it. I mean, that's what obviously Democrat Governor Tim Walz would have wanted. Everybody just shut up. Everybody ignore said issue. Everybody ignore said problem. Nothing to see here. Close your eyes, plug your ears. There's nothing to see, nothing to hear going on in the state of Minnesota. How dare they, quote unquote, take advantage of this situation and call out the fraud under his watch? What a ridiculous open. We're 28 seconds into his comments, and this is where we already are. It's already somebody else's fault.
I don't want to mince words here. Donald Trump and his allies in Washington and in St. Paul and online want to make our state a colder, meaner place. They want to poison our people against each other by attacking our neighbors.
Isn't this unbelievable? Now we're 42 seconds in. It's Donald Trump's fault, and it's his cronies online and his cronies in St. Paul that are trying to divide the state. They're trying to rip the thread, the fabric that keeps the state of Minnesota together. Once again, the evil, awful, terrible Donald Trump strikes in the state of Minnesota. I guess, again, under his direction, under his watch, nobody should have said a word. We should have all just kept silent. I didn't get the memo from the Democrat governor of Minnesota that I wasn't allowed or I wasn't supposed to talk about this because it's my fault. I'm the problem. Nick Shirley is the problem. Other media entities and outlets that have been exposing this. They're the problem. Donald Trump, who's been calling this out very clearly now for the better part of a month, he's the problem too. Everybody else is the problem, not the actual people. Oh, I don't know, committing said fraud.
And ultimately, they want to take away much of what makes Minnesota the best place in the country to raise a family.
It's not true.
They've already begun trying to withhold funds that were meant to help families afford child care. And they have no intention of stopping there. Make no mistake, we should be concerned about fraud in our state government.
Oh, really?
We cannot effectively deliver programs and services if we can't earn the public's trust.
Yeah, you don't say, Tim. I mean, it's probably the most honest thing he has said in the entire announcement thus far. We have to go after these fraudsters. I agree with that, actually. I agree with the Minnesota governor. We have to hold said individuals accountable for their actions. I agree with the governor. I agree with his comments. But notice how very early on in his comments, he is already deflecting the situation. He is already trying to point the finger and put the blame on somebody else's back. And folks, we talked about this yesterday. This is the difference between strong leadership and weak leadership. A strong leader, of which Tim Walz is not. I mean, that is abundantly clear. We watched him on the national stage. We watched him running as a vice president. He brought nothing to the equation whatsoever. He was not a charismatic candidate. He brought nothing to that presidential ticket at all. He was another boring politician from somewhere in the United States. I mean, literally brings nothing, brought nothing to that presidential ticket in any way, shape, or form. He's as milquetoast and as boring as it gets. That was on full display for everybody across the United States to see. Brought nothing to the equation. But a strong leader, somebody that is capable of, as Tim Walz was trying to be, the number 2 man in the country, this is not the appropriate response. This is not the appropriate answer. He should have come out and immediately opened his commentary by, first of all, resigning from office, which is what he should do right now because he oversaw all of this. A, he should resign from his position as the governor of Minnesota. And number 2, he should have accepted full responsibility and not talked about everybody else. Let's be perfectly clear with this. Donald Trump is not the reason that there's rampant amounts of Somali fraud in the state of Minnesota. Nick Shirley, who once again, and I don't say this to denigrate him in any way, shape, or form, a guy in his mid-20s with an iPhone and a couple of clip-on Bluetooth microphones you can buy on Amazon. Again, not to disparage him in any way, shape, or form. He, Nick Shirley, the guy with the iPhone and the microphones, is not responsible for the fraud in Minnesota. People commenting on said situation like I am right now, I'm not responsible for the fraud in the state of Minnesota. He is attempting to shift the blame, shift the responsibility to people that are not part of the equation at all. They're just commenting on it. They're calling it out. They're exposing it. It is not their fault that it is happening. They are not complicit in the fraud that has been and seemingly continues to unfold in his state. But here we are, a minute and 8 seconds into his comments, and we've already heard Donald Trump's name. We've already heard the cronies and the people around Trump, leadership and government in St. Paul. And as we continue through his comments, you'll hear more about how it's everybody else's fault but Tim Walz. You'll hear how it's everybody else's fault minus him and his administration, who are the ones that are actually responsible for it, or the individuals that are physically responsible for the fraud themselves. There are 2 parties that are responsible for this. The government in the state of Minnesota that allowed this rampant fraud to take place with no sufficient checks or balances to make sure something like this couldn't happen. And 2, the people actually committing the fraud. The people actually responsible for submitting bogus, garbage invoices to the state of Minnesota for services they were not providing. Those are the two parties responsible, no one else. Everything else is outside noise. Everything else is individuals now highlighting said problem. But it is not their fault. It's not Nick Shirley's fault. It's not Donald Trump's fault that this is now on the national stage, that this is now being exposed. As we continue to listen to Walz's commentary, this is a growing trend in the Democrat Party where there is no level of accountability and no seemingly any ability at all to do any sort of inward reflection. To look at a situation and say, we screwed this up. We were wrong. We didn't handle this appropriately. We didn't do a good job with this. Does not exist. Always pointing the finger at somebody else. And I am pretty confident that the American people are starting to see this. Starting to wrap their head around how it is always the same tack with those on the political left. Always somebody else's fault. It's never their own. And almost all of the time, it's the fault of the Republicans. Even when they're not in positions of power, they have no authority over the situation whatsoever. It's always their fault. More from the Minnesota governor.
That's why over the past few years, we've made systemic changes in the way we do business. We've gone to the legislature time and time again to get more tools to combat fraud. We've hired people we fired people who weren't doing their jobs. We've seen people go to jail for stealing from our state. We've cut off whole streams of funding in partnership with the federal government where we saw widespread criminal activity. We've put new locks on the doors of our remaining programs, and we've hired a new head of program integrity to make sure that those locks can't be broken. All across this state, Minnesotans are hard at work on this problem. Advocates, administrators, investigators are on the front lines defending the integrity of our state's programs. And I want to give a very heartfelt thank you to all of them.
Bravo.
There is more to do. A single taxpayer dollar wasted on fraud should be intolerable.
You know, it should be. I actually, once again, agree with the governor, but that's not actually what he thinks. Because this fraud had been exposed long before Nick Shirley's video the week of Christmas. This has been something that has been going all the way back to 2020. I've got this New York Times article. This article was published back on November the 29th of 2025, so just before the calendar flipped over to November. And I want to read a couple of pieces of this article because it's incredibly relevant to the entire story here. In 2020, making sure my notes are correct here, it's currently 2026. But the article reads, in 2020, Minnesota's Department of Education officials who administered the program became overwhelmed by the number of applicants seeking to register new feeding sites and began raising questions about the plausibility of some invoices. This was in the heat of the COVID-19 pandemic. You had a bunch of fraudsters and shysters in the state of Minnesota conducting alleged feeding sites during the COVID-19 pandemic when the entire world was shut down. You had these groups running fake sites, not feeding people, not providing said services, and billing the state of Minnesota. This was in 2020. This was going on. A group, one of the largest, that was providing these alleged programs, Feeding Our Future was the name of the group. It's the nonprofit group in Minnesota, responded with a warning to the concerns from the Department of Education. In an email, the group told the state agency that failing to promptly approve new applicants from, quote, minority-owned businesses would result in a lawsuit featuring accusations of racism that would be, quote, sprawled across the news. Feeding Our Future later sued the agency, which continued reimbursing claims and approving new sites in the months that followed. So the Minnesota Department of Education seemingly did their job. They knew that something was fishy. They started questioning the plausibility of some of these invoices. They obviously ran this up the food chain. No pun intended. They obviously started sounding the alarm that something fraudulent could have potentially be going on here. They were threatened with a lawsuit claiming that they were racist, and other reports indicate those that were investigating this within the Department of Education in Minnesota were bringing this to the administrative branch, which would be Tim Walz's position and post, were told, back off. You're getting a little too close to the fire on this. You better be careful going down this rabbit hole. Why? Because it was all political. And this same article over at the New York Times, again, published back in November of 2025, highlights the issue. Highlights how those within the state were afraid to do something because they didn't want to tick off the prominently Democratic Somali voting bloc in the state. Here's a quote from the article. Keisha Megan, a Somalian American who formerly worked as a fraud investigator for Minnesota's Attorney General's office, said elected officials in the state, and particularly those who were part of the state's Democrat-led administration, aka the Walz regime, were reluctant to take more assertive action in response to allegations in the Somali community. Here is a direct quote from her from the New York Times article. There is a perception that forcefully tackling this issue might cause political backlash among the Somali community, which is a core voting bloc for Democrats. End quote. Tim Walz knew about this. His administration knew about this. Back in 2020, people started sounding the alarm, including the individual who is a Somali American who worked as a fraud investigator within the Minnesota Attorney General's office. And even she was able to pretty quickly wrap her head around the problem going on here. They were reluctant to take it more seriously. They were reluctant to do anything about it because they could not afford to lose the solid Democrat Somali voting bloc in the state of Minnesota. So you just heard from Tim Walz a few minutes ago that any dollar worth of fraud, any amount of fraud in the state is not appropriate, is a slap in the face to taxpayers in the state of Minnesota. He doesn't believe that. If he truly believed it, he would have tackled this issue back in 2020 when people started sounding the alarm, when people started questioning, oh, let's start digging into these invoices. Some of this stuff doesn't seem plausible. Yet his administration was not interested in doing so. They did not want to look as if they were holding the Somali community in the state of Minnesota responsible. I'm going to roll back Walz's comments just a little bit. Again, listen exactly to the words that come out of his mouth.
Problem. Advocates, administrators, investigators are on the front lines defending the integrity of our state's programs. And I want to give a very heartfelt thank you to all of them. There is more to do. A single taxpayer dollar wasted on fraud should be intolerable. And while there's a role to play for everyone, from the legislature to prosecutors to insurance companies to local and county government, the buck does stop with me.
Oh, really?
My administration has been taking fast, decisive action to solve this crisis. We'll win the fight against the fraudsters. But the political gamesmanship we're seeing from Republicans is only making that fight harder. We've got Republicans here in the state legislature playing hide and seek with potential whistleblowers. We've got conspiracy theorist right-wing YouTubers breaking into our daycares, demanding access to our children.
Oh, yes. There it is. There's the dog whistle. Conspiracy theorist right-wing YouTubers. They are the true problem. Not the Somali community operating the fraud sites. Not the individuals that Walz surrounded himself with in his administration that turned a blind eye to the problem when folks started blowing the whistle on it back in 2020. They're not the problem. It's the Republicans in the Minnesota legislature. It's Donald Trump, and it's Nick Shirley, the mid-20-something-year-old YouTuber. They are all the problem. It's the conspiracy theorists that are the problem. What's the conspiracy here? I'm very familiar with the term conspiracy theorist. I know what the term is. I know what a conspiracy theory is. What's the conspiracy here? The Nick Shirley video is not a conspiracy at all. It is using publicly available records to go to said daycare sites and see what's going on. And as you saw in the 42 some odd minute video, which has received hundreds of millions of views at this point, What you saw in that video was pretty darn clear. The facilities don't exist. There's no operations going on. There's no children there. The spelling is wrong. The phone numbers are disconnected. There's nothing actually happening. What's the conspiracy? Seriously, what is it? Is he arguing that maybe the records that the state of Minnesota made publicly available aren't accurate? Because if that's the case, that's an even larger controversy and scandal. But no, it's Nick Shirley's fault. It's Donald Trump's fault. It's my fault. And it's your fault for having the audacity to look into said problem, for having the audacity to call out the fraud that exists in this state. Everybody else's fault. And you'd heard just a little bit there. Tim Walz makes the comment, the buck stops here. Agreed. And then immediately a diatribe about the Republican legislature the Republican legislators in the state of Minnesota, Donald Trump, and conspiracy theory right-wing YouTubers. Really? Those are the guys that are responsible? Not the people running the fraud, not the two guys standing out front of the so-called Quality Leering Center smoking cigarettes all day. It's not their fault. No, it's Nick Shirley's fault. It's Donald Trump's fault. Once again, evil, awful, terrible orange man bad. It's his fault. Complete and total lack of self-awareness from Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. Got a couple of comments coming in on our Rumble live chat this morning. In addition, the comment reads, he will not call out the Somalian thieves due to racism. A thief is a thief regardless of skin color. You're absolutely correct, and that's exactly what this New York Times article shows. I mean, that's exactly what the quote here is. And you heard it from that Feeding Our, whatever it's called, Feeding Our Future group. They literally emailed the Minnesota Department of Education publicly and said, we're going to sue you and claim that you're a bunch of racists if you don't give money to the so-called Somali community that's helping people during COVID, which, by the way, of course, they weren't doing. They were just running a sham, running a fraud. That was their play. And that's pretty typical, right? We see this play all the time. We've seen it now for decades. When you don't get your way, when you don't get what you want, you cry racism, and then the problem is magically solved. We've seen this game played over and over again. It's nothing new. Walz and his folks knew about it. They were aware of it. They refused to do anything about it. We'll hear more from the illustrious Minnesota governor coming up here in just a couple of minutes as the Nick Craig Show rolls on a Tuesday morning. I want to thank the law group here in Wilmington for their continued support, allowing us to do this program each and every weekday morning. And I want to remind you that when legal challenges arise, make sure you put your trust in Melissa Gott and the team at the law group here in Wilmington. For now more than 22 years, their experienced attorneys have provided high-quality, affordable legal services across the eastern half of our state. Whether you're facing a divorce, navigating a real estate transaction, or maybe you're in a position where you need a strong defense, the law group has your back. Their dedicated team ensures your questions are answered and issues are resolved as promptly as possible. Great news, folks. They're not some big national law firm. They're located right here in our backyard, downtown Wilmington, and just a phone call away at 910-251-6088, or you can visit them online at lawgroupnc.com. Give them a call, 910-251-6088, or their website, lawgroupnc.com. The Law Group, experience and dedication you can rely on. Appreciate Melissa Gott and the Law Group and their continued support here of the Nick Craig Show. All right, we'll grab a quick break. More comments in the pretty big announcement yesterday. I think accurately to describe it that way, of Minnesota Governor Tim Walz announcing he's done. He's throwing in the towel, not running for re-election because the heat is a little bit too hot in the kitchen for him there in the state of Minnesota. We'll have more from him coming up after this as the Nick Craig Show rolls along on a Tuesday morning, streaming live 7 a.m., YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook, and available 24/7 wherever you get your podcasts. And welcome back to the Nick Craig Show as we continue our coverage of the failed Minnesota governor and Tim Walz. An announcement from him on Monday that he is hanging up his hat after this term. He was set to run for re-election in 2026. However, due to the potentially multi-billions of dollars worth of fraud that has now been exposed in the state of Minnesota, it's a little too warm there in the kitchen for Tim Walz, so he is deciding to hang up his hat. And of course, he's blaming everybody else. It's Donald Trump's fault. It's Nick Shirley's fault. It's the radical, out-of-control, right-wing conspiracy theorists' fault for what's going on in his home state of Minnesota, where he's the top dog as the governor. It's not his fault at all. More from the Minnesota governor.
We've got Republicans here in the state legislature playing hide and seek with potential whistleblowers. We've got conspiracy theorist right-wing YouTubers breaking into our daycares, demanding access to our children. We've got the President of the United States demonizing our Somali neighbors and wrongfully confiscating funds that Minnesotans rely on. It's disgusting and it's dangerous.
Ah, yes.
Republicans are playing politics with the future of this state. It's shameful. And I've said it before, and I will continue to say it. We welcome ideas from anyone, in any party, from any walk of life, who wants to help us continue to stay ahead of these criminals. And we welcome the involvement of the federal government. I am grateful to the career professionals at the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI who have been helping us fight this fight for years. But I cannot abide the actions of the political leadership in Washington. These opportunists are willing to hurt our people to score cheap points. They and their allies have no intention of helping us solve this problem, and every intention of trying to profit off of it.
Hold on a second again. There we go with the same old meme. They're trying to profit off of it. Donald Trump cut off the flow of funds to put a temporary stopgap in place to immediately slam the brakes on said fraud. He announced that just in the last couple of weeks. But once again, all that you hear from those on the political left is they're just trying to profit from it. No, the people trying to profit from it, Tim, are the individuals in your state, most predominantly those in the Somali community, who are actually committing said fraud. This administration has done more in Washington, D.C., more to highlight and stop the fraud than your administration has done in the better part of 6 years now since it's been going on. But constant deflection from the issues from Democrats.
Which brings me to this. 2026 is an election year. Election years have a way of ramping up the politics at a time when we simply can't afford more of that in Minnesota. In September, I announced that I would seek a historic third term as Minnesota's governor. And I have every confidence that if I gave it my all, we would win the race.
Not true.
But as I reflect on this moment with my family and my team over the holidays, I came to the conclusion that I can't give a political campaign my all. Every minute that I spend defending my own political interest would be a minute I can't spend defending the people of Minnesota against the criminals who prey on our generosity and the cynics who want to prey on our differences.
What a scumbag. I mean, there's no other way to describe this guy. So he can't run for re-election. He can't seek a third term as the governor of Minnesota because every minute that he spends on that campaign, he is not going to spend time cracking down on fraud. Tim, people in your administration were calling this issue out back in 2020. Some of this fraud has been taking place for 6 years. And now you're at a point where you say, oh, I can't possibly give any more time. You just ran as vice president of the United States. You can't run another gubernatorial race in Minnesota, but you had time in 2024 to run as the second most powerful person in the country? There's no consistency with that argument in any way, shape, or form. The fraud existed in 2024. It exists now in 2026. There's one key difference. It's being exposed now at a much larger, grandiose scale. It was not as big of an issue. It was discussed. There were articles about it. There were local newspapers and local television stations in the state of Minnesota that were looking into this issue and highlighting it, but it didn't have the national attention that it does now. So Tim Walz is going to crack down for the next year on fraud in the state. Meanwhile, he was just able to run as vice president about a year ago. Do you not understand how idiotic that statement is? How ridiculous that statement is? We're talking about Democrats after all, so maybe I shouldn't be surprised. More from the Minnesota governor.
So I've decided to step out of this race, and I'll let others worry about the election while I focus on the work that's in front of me for the next year.
Oh, wow. Great.
I'm passing on this race with zero sadness and zero regret. I did not run for this job to have the job. I ran for the job to do the job. Minnesota faces enormous challenges this year, and I refuse to spend a single minute doing anything other than rising to meet this moment. Minnesota has always come first and always will. That's what I believe servant leadership demands of me. As an optimist, I'll hold out some hope that my friends on the other side of the aisle will consider what servant leadership demands of them in the moment. We can work together to combat against the criminals. We can work together to rebuild the public's trust and make our state stronger. But make no mistake about it, if Republicans continue down the path of abusing power, smearing entire communities, and running their own fraudulent game at the expense of Minnesotans, I will fight back with everything that I have.
Wait, hold on a second. What fraudulent game are the Republicans running? I don't understand that comment at all. So now the fraudulent games are being portrayed and operated by the right? How does that work? Tim Walz is a Democrat. He's in charge of the state of Minnesota. He's the top dog. He's the chief. What fraud are the Republicans now perpetrating on the good people of Minnesota? It makes no sense.
I am absolutely confident a Democratic and a DFLer will hold this seat come November. I'm confident that I'll find ways to contribute to the state that I love long after next January. But there'll be time to worry about all that later. Today, I'm proud of the work we've done to make Minnesota America's best place to live and raise kids.
Not true.
From our new paid leave policy to our child tax credit to our school lunch programs feeding every single child. And I'm doubly proud of the incredible team we put together to make this vision a reality. I want to take a moment to thank every member of my staff, to every single state employee who has been part of this fight. Now more than ever, I need you on the job. I need you to help work together to tackle the important work in front of us. And most of all, I want Minnesotans to know how grateful I am for the opportunity to serve this state, for the privilege that I have been given to serve in this office. I'm on the job. I'm focused on making sure that we stay America's best place to live and raise kids. No one will take that away from us. I'm proud of the way we treat our neighbors. I'm proud of the way that we welcome people to this state. I'm proud of the way that we innovate. And I'm proud of the way that we are optimists for the future. No one's taking this away from us. Not the fraudsters. Certainly not this president. Not on my watch.
Notice how he puts more emphasis on the president stealing and taking this away than he does the actual fraudsters. You could hear it, the inflection in his voice. The fraudsters aren't going to take it away, and certainly not the president. Much louder in his discussion of the president. This is unfortunately par for the course with the current Democrat Party, and it's one of the reasons that I think that they're in deep trouble, genuinely. We see this here in North Carolina, and you're seeing it now in full-on display in Minnesota. It is always somebody else's fault. It is never the responsibility of the Democrats. I mean, just look at what's gone on here in North Carolina over the last 6 months. You had a 22-year-old Ukrainian refugee murdered on the Charlotte light rail by a known career criminal that was out on the street because of Democrats' soft on crime policies. Because Democrats didn't feel it was a good idea to put a dangerous, violent criminal behind bars or in a mental hospital. They allowed him to be out on the street. That's DeCarlos Brown Jr., in which he murdered Arena Zarutska on the Charlotte light rail back in August. And when that news came out, when that story gained incredible amounts of national and international media coverage, it wasn't their fault. It was somebody else's fault. It was the General Assembly's fault. It was the Republicans' fault. Somehow, even though Republicans don't control the city council, don't control the county commission in Mecklenburg County, have no control whatsoever. Gary McFadden is not a Republican. The magistrates are not Republicans. The DAs are not Republicans. Yet it was somehow the Republicans' fault. This tact, this attempt is just not working anymore. This may have worked in years past when there was less access to independent media, when there was less access to what I will describe as the truth available on places like X, on Facebook, and other places throughout the internet. I don't think it works anymore. And I think we are starting to see now in real time that this tack of always pointing the finger at the other party when you are the one responsible, like Tim Walz and his Democrat administration was in Minnesota, that this story just doesn't work anymore. It doesn't play. People have woken up to it. People can see through the garbage. They can see through the nonsense. They're not falling for it. To the chagrin of the Minnesota governor, to the chagrin of the people in Minnesota that have unfortunately had to deal with this, it's obviously not working. And my evidence to back that up is the fact that Walz is dropping out. If he thought he could weather through this storm, if he thought that he could hold his chin high, claim that he was going to crack down on this fraud and deliver economic success and prosperity for the people of Minnesota, he'd continue his election bid. He would not be dropping out of the race. He would seek a third term as the governor of Minnesota. There's a reason he's not, and it's not the BS reason that he gave. I'm going to spend every waking moment and every minute over the next year fighting fraud. That's got nothing to do with it at all. It's got everything to do with the political winds are not blowing in his direction, and he knows that if he runs for re-election, he is going to get destroyed in the general election, because whoever his opponent is can talk about one thing and one thing only: tens of billions of dollars worth of fraud under his watch in the state of Minnesota. And he will have no recourse. He will have nothing to say. He will have no way to dispel it at all. It will suck all of the air out of the room as it relates to that gubernatorial election. He can't win. So he's stepping down, which is, I mean, a smart political move, sure. But the framing of it is so disingenuous. The framing of it could not be any less accurate. Here's a guy, to put a nice little bow on this whole thing. Here's a guy whose administration knew about the fraud going all the way back to 2020. They were afraid to do anything about it because they couldn't afford to piss off the Somali community in Minnesota. Couldn't afford to piss off that solid Democrat voting base that exists in Minnesota. So they did nothing. They turned a blind eye. They looked the other way. They allowed the people of Minnesota, and by the way, also federal taxpayers. This is not just a problem. And I got a comment, an email last week when I was talking about this from some moron saying, why don't you spend time talking about what's going on in North Carolina? No, this impacts you as well. A little bit later on this year, you're going to be paying the tax man in Washington, D.C. IRS tax time, the most wonderful time of the year. The hell with Christmas. It's all about tax time for me. You're going to be paying money to the federal government later this year. You've already been paying them in every paycheck that you get throughout the year. That money goes to the federal government and funds some of these programs in Minnesota. The child care, definitely during COVID, these feeding sites that were set up by these sham Somali refugees, that was all federal funds. Yes, there's state funds in there too, but it's a lot of federal money. That's your and my taxpayer dollars. That's every single citizen across the United States who pays their taxes. That's your money too. This is not just a Minnesota problem. There was a lot of federal funds, potentially billions of dollars worth of federal monies siphoned off by fraudsters in Minnesota so they could ride around in their Lamborghinis. Meanwhile, the hardworking Americans in the state of Minnesota are struggling day in and day out to keep food on the table, keep the lights on. You've got these Somali refugees coming into the United States, milking the system, committing rampant amounts of fraud, And now the governor says it's his top priority. Tim, if only this was your top priority 5 freaking years ago, maybe you wouldn't be in this position. I would even make this point. This might sound a little crazy, but hear me out on it. If Tim Walz had taken this seriously back in 2020 as a Democrat and championed this as an issue, he could have maybe been a presidential candidate. Seriously. This would have put him in an incredible position. I am a Democrat. I am fighting fraud. I am battling back against individuals who want to take advantage of the goodwill, the good nature of the federal government and state governments across the U.S. This could have risen him to an unbelievable level of prominence and success. It could have. But instead, he sat on his hands, shoved his head up his ass, and pretended that the problem wasn't happening. That's what he did. That's what the evidence backs up. Once again, looking at this article over at the New York Times, former fraud investigator with the Minnesota Attorney General's office said elected officials in the state, and particularly those that were part of the state's Democrat-led administration, were reluctant to take more assertive action in response to the allegations in the Somali community because they didn't want to be deemed as racist. They didn't want to potentially piss off that voting bloc and lose statewide elections. So while you have to listen to the pearl clutching from Tim Walz about how dare Donald Trump make this political, how dare right-wing conspiracy theorists make this political, meanwhile, his entire administration made this situation political. They refused to investigate said fraud because of politics. But once again, rules for thee, but not for me. He can now stand on his ivory tower and claim, this is not political. This shouldn't be political. Tim, the only reason you're in this spot is because of politics, buddy. You allowed your political blinders to allow this situation to completely spiral out of control. And now he's paying the consequences for it. He's paying the price, and he should be. As his comment coming in on our Rumble live chat, he got fired. Damn straight he did. I think he should resign, frankly. He won't, but I think he should. If he truly wants to get somebody in there that is going to crack down on this problem, crack down on this issue, he should say, I failed the people of Minnesota. I didn't do the job that they elected me to do. Therefore, I'm resigning my post of office. I'm resigning the position that I hold. That's obviously not going to happen. I'm going to close on this. It is amazing to me, and this really goes to show you the current state of, I say journalism. I want to be careful with my use of that word. Maybe I'll use the term media to better describe it. A 20-something-year-old YouTuber in a 40-some-odd minute video has ended Tim Walz's political career. Let that sink in for a second. The ability to post a video on X, the ability to post a video on YouTube, has ended the political career of a governor in the United States of America. I would contend that is a good thing. I would contend that the ability for individuals to produce that kind of content, to highlight issues that the vast majority of the media wanted to ignore because, of course, it painted their party in a bad light, is an incredibly good situation. Is there risks with it? Absolutely. Is it always going to be good? No, probably not. But let that sink in for a second. Nick Shirley, the name that I will admit I was not familiar with back right before Christmas took place. A name I was not familiar with has ended the political career of Tim Walz. This guy was the freaking vice presidential nominee a year ago. That is truly remarkable. Some comments coming in on our Rumble live chat. Thank God Elon Musk purchased Twitter and turned it into X. Could not agree with that comment anymore. Another comment, Nick Shirley is an American hero. Yeah, hard to argue with either of those points. This is why like traditional legacy media is in such a miserable position right now. Because a 20-something-year-old with a camera and a couple of clip-on microphones can get more media attention, more coverage than they could possibly ever dream of. Many of them are refusing to adapt. Many of them are refusing to cover things in a way in which people want to consume it. And so they continue to lose audience. They continue to lose viewership. And people like Nick Shirley have been skyrocketed into unimaginable amounts of success. I haven't looked at his X account in a couple of days, but he's currently got 1.2 million followers. And his video, the full 42-minute video that he published on his X account, which, again, if you haven't watched, I'd encourage you to, has more than 138 million views. That's just on X. That doesn't include the millions of views on YouTube. That doesn't include the millions of views of people reposting the video and it being shared on other social media platforms. Remarkable. 138 million views. Highlighting, shining a light on, and laying out the case for rampant amounts of fraud in the state of Minnesota. Sayonara to Tim Walz. Thank God Donald Trump won in 2024. Can you imagine this freaking clown as the vice president of the United States? You thought the Biden-Harris administration was bad? Can you imagine the Harris-Walz administration? Good Lord. Talk about incompetence. Talk about the lack of strong leadership. America truly dodged a bullet with that situation. Seriously, we dodged a major, major bullet in 2024. Remarkable situation. I want to once again thank the Law Group for their continued support of the show. You can visit them online, lawgroupnc.com, or give them a call at 910-251-6088. Well, that's going to do it for a Tuesday edition of the Nick Craig Show. Don't forget that we stream live weekday mornings, 7 a.m., YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook, and available 24/7 wherever you get your podcasts. You can also listen to the Nick Craig Show on delay in the Charlotte radio market on 107.9 FM. WBT, the Nick Craig Show, airs weeknights 9 to 10 p.m. That's going to do it. We're back here tomorrow morning right here for the Nick Craig Show.